Before you put that on, that was a very exciting talk, and I have some quite exciting questions as well. Vamos começar com a pergunta da praticalidade do anarcocapitalismo, da praticalidade das leis privadas. Eu tenho duas perguntas aqui. Por que o anarcocapitalismo ainda não surgiu? Os Estados nacionais impedem o surgimento de concorrência? Como levar o anarcocapitalismo para a realidade? Essa pergunta do Rafael Gutmann. E como se poderia também, na mesma linha, como se poderia implantar tal sistema de leis privadas, levando em consideração que o governo tende a não abrir mão do seu direito de legislar?
Yeah, that's a good set of questions, and I think my son spent an hour or so giving his answers to those questions in effect. And in a sense, he's really following on a line of argument that I made 30-some years ago. I think revolution is usually a poor policy, that as the world now is, the real reason people want government is so they won't be murdered in their beds, and therefore the more chaos you have, the more support there is for strong government. So I think the right strategy is one that involves in some way privately developing alternatives to government, sort of gradually replacing government rather than overthrowing government. So that from that standpoint, 40 or 50 years ago, if somebody suggested that we don't really need a government post office, most people would say that's absurd. The mail wouldn't get delivered. Nowadays, when somebody says that, you say, by the way, where did you get that UPS package from? Because we now have several private firms which are competing with the post office successfully in part of its activities and are not competing it in the other activities because it's against the law to compete with it in the direct delivery of mail. So that example, it seems to me, helps people be less supportive of the kind of policies that I'm opposing. Similarly, there has been a considerable development in the U.S. of gated communities where you have a housing development where in effect protection is being provided privately, not publicly. There's a lot of commercial arbitration where people are essentially avoiding the court system in order to use private courts. So I think that one route in the direction I'm proposing is the continual development of substitutes, especially for things governments do very badly, so that people will find that although the government is still doing something, they're not really using the government anymore. Similarly, homeschooling and private schooling, the more people are sending their children to non-government schools, the less the political support for government schools. So, one could go into a long discussion here. But I think that's one path. There is another very different path which interests me partly because I'm interested in technologies and their effects on the world. And if you read my most recent book, which is called Future Imperfect, and which is a book about technological revolutions that may be happening and their implications, one possibility is for an online world that government has very little control over. That there are technologies now known involving encryption which would make possible a cyberspace, an online world where an individual could combine anonymity with reputation, in which I can prove to someone else online that I'm the same person he interacted with yesterday, so I can have a reputation. But I do not have to tell anybody at all what the link is between the online identity and the real space identity. And it is very hard to tax or regulate somebody if you do not know who he is. So in that world, one could imagine the development of something like anarcho-capitalism, probably using only reputational enforcement, because I also can't send my goons to pick up my television set if I don't know who he is. But I can use ways of telling other people in cyberspace that he's not to be trusted if he has violated a contract with me. And there are technologies available by which I can prove to other people that he violated a contract with me. And this involves the use of digital signatures, which I discuss. So if you read the early chapters of Future Imperfect, which you can do for free because it's on my website as well as being published, that will suggest a possible technological future in which governments continue to control real space. They continue to control the physical reality, but more and more of people's lives is being lived in cyberspace, and in which cyberspace could end up as something rather like the kind of anarcho-capitalism I'm describing. So that's a different answer to the same question. And of course, the third answer is the one that Patri gave you a little while ago. I am a little less optimistic than he is. I think that, like most radical ideas, his will probably fail. But there is some chance that it will succeed, and if it succeeds, it could have very attractive results.
Agora temos conjunto de perguntas similares, eu vou ler todas elas. Como esse sistema de arbitragem, através de agentes privados, poderia solucionar com neutralidade questões que envolvessem partes com capacidade econômica distintas? Afinal, ainda que possamos discordar, o Estado é supostamente neutro para tratar esses conflitos. As melhores agências tenderiam a ser contratadas pela parte mais rica. Essa pergunta foi anônima. Agora uma pergunta do Daniel Kuhn, na mesma linha.
Let me do one
Okay.
at a time. Do we observe that more money is spent building Cadillacs or building Fords? That is to say, I think it is a mistake to suppose that private firms only specialize in the rich. There aren't enough rich. So I assume that a private firm is happy to sell a service which includes special guards at a high price to a rich person, and a service which only provides an ordinary level of protection to a non-rich person. But if the arbitration agencies consistently rule against my customers in favor of your customers, I am going to stop agreeing to use that agency. So I don't see there's any reason to expect it. Furthermore, I think the idea that government is neutral does not, as we say in English, pass the giggle test. I don't know how many people have been paying attention to U.S. politics, but there is at least one respect in which Obama is consistent, and that is that anything he wants to do that costs more money, he says the rich are going to pay for. I'm not sure it's true. I'm not saying he's consistent in what he does, but he's consistent in what he says. And that's perfectly normal, that, of course, politicians will appeal, I'm not just saying only the rich. Some politicians would say, you know, those other people over there will pay for it, or only the criminals will pay for it, or only the illegal immigrants will. It doesn't matter what group, but governments are never neutral. And part of the difference, fundamental difference between governments and markets, is that in a market, the most I can do to you is not to deal with you. In a political system, I can hurt you much worse than that. I can put you in jail, I can kill you, or I can just take money from you. So there's a sense in which the political system is almost automatically a war of each against all, to use Hobbes' term, because you've got a sort of fixed cake out there and we're fighting over the pieces. In the market, what I am doing if I want to make money is not fighting over pieces, it's trying to produce some more cake and sell it to someone. And that is a very much less divisive project. I'm not arguing there are never any conflicts. Obviously, I would like Apple to make exactly the computers I want. I have my list of desires for the next cell phone, and if HTC refuses to follow them, I will be unhappy. But nonetheless, they aren't making me worse off. They just may or may not be making me as much better off as I wish they would. It has, by the way, a 5-inch screen, if anybody wants to design the next cell phone for me. And unlike Dell's 5-inch screen, it does not run on the AT&T network.
Uma pergunta do Daniel Kuhn, que é da OAB do Rio Grande do Sul. E o que ocorreria com aquelas pessoas que não possam pagar por uma law enforcement firm, a sua integridade física e sua propriedade não seria violada?
Maybe. To begin with, the people who can't pay don't have very much property to violate. So the incentive to steal from someone who has nothing is not very high. Beyond that, I presume that if there are some very, very impoverished people in a decent society, there will be other people who are willing to contribute to give them some minimal level of protection. Just as I expect that without government, you would still not see people starving in the streets, because in societies at least like ours, in relatively rich societies, almost everybody has enough to feed many people, and if there are a few people who are in really serious need, someone is likely to help them. I think that's the evidence of the past and is likely to be true in the future. But in general, one of the standard arguments for government is that it redistributes income. And one of the standard arguments against is that it frequently redistributes it perversely. That is, it quite often redistributes from the poor to the rich, as well as sometimes from the rich to the poor. And that whichever direction it's redistributing it in, it is usually a very expensive process, so that what one side gets is a lot less than what the other side loses. That could be a long argument. It's an interesting argument. I'm not claiming that it's obviously right, but I think that's part really of the general argument for or against laissez-faire, not anything special to the argument for laissez-faire and rights protection, because after all, not having police protection is pretty bad, but not having food is worse. And in a ordinary free market society with the government, still it's the private market that's producing the food.
A próxima pergunta diz respeito a grandes agências de right enforcement. Imagino que exista economias de escala para as agências crescerem. E como então impedir que essa agência de right enforcement, a mais popular e poderosa, não acabe se tornando um Estado, não tome o poder à força e submeta a população aos seus desejos?
I regret that, unlike my son, I have no duckies to give away. But that's a very good and important question. And as economists know, there are both economies and diseconomies of scale. That a situation where one very large firm can produce more cheaply than multiple small firms is uncommon but occasionally exists. And in my view, one of the most important questions about whether the institutions I describe would be stable is how far the economies of scale go in this industry. If it turns out that one firm providing protection to a third of the population of the United States can do a better job than 5 firms providing smaller numbers, you will then end up with a market with only a few large firms in it. And those few large firms may well decide that robbery is more profitable than protection, merge and become a government, and reestablish taxation. If you end up with an equilibrium in which there are 150 or 500 or 1,000 firms, which is many fewer than the number of farmers we have, more than the number of automobile companies, somewhere between, then if 1 or 2 or 3 firms decide to start robbing their customers by being governments, the customers will call in other firms to protect them. So that, I think, is an important question. There's a second question linked to it, which the question that was asked also hints at. And that's to observe that the rights enforcement agencies are really producing 2 quite different products. One of them is the product of enforcing the rights of their customers. The other is the product of threatening other agencies in order to get good terms on their mutual contracts. Because everybody knows that in the ultimate breakdown, if we can't reach agreement, we start shooting each other. And if I have more guns, that may make you more willing to reach agreement. This is important because the application of military force does have large economies of scale. So if it turns out that a large part of what the firms are producing is the ability to threaten each other and only a small part is the real service, then you'll have large firms. On the other hand, I think if you look at similar conflicts, at situations where you've got sort of an implicit threat game underlying agreements, which describes, for example, all of international policy. All right, in all of international policy, why do governments not do bad things to other governments? Because somebody will shoot back if they do. Nonetheless, if you look at international history, you do not observe that every time a country buys a new battleship, the border moves by half a mile. It looks as though there's enormous inertia in these threat games, so that once you've reached some kind of an agreement on the mutual terms, it takes a big imbalance before I can say, I don't like that anymore, I'm tearing up the agreement, I want a better one. That at least is the evidence I think you see from the case of international activities. So my guess is that if you could once get the system I'm describing established, which is not an easy problem, that once it's going, if a firm says to all the firms it's bargaining with, I've just hired some soldiers, I want to renegotiate all our contracts. The other firms will say, we're sorry, we don't deal with people like that. If you want to fight a war with 100 other firms, feel free, but reasonable people don't go around pointing guns at each other unless they have a good reason to. So my guess is that if you can get it established, most of what matters for an agency is how well it can protect its customers. If that's the case, there's no obvious reason to have big economies of scale, and if that's the case, we may have a successful arrangement. But I certainly don't want to claim that under all imaginable circumstances what I'm describing would work, because I'm sure there are some circumstances in which, for any of several reasons, the anarcho-capitalism I'm describing will break down and won't function. Just as we know that there are some circumstances in which governments behave very, very badly and create a great deal of difficulty. There's an academic who has a web page devoted to estimating how many of their own citizens governments kill. And I think his current estimate for the 20th century is about 200 million. That's adding up all what he calls democide, which is not war. It's governments killing their own citizens for one reason or another. And some of that was the colonial regimes in Africa early in the 20th century, the Belgian Congo being a famous example. Some of that was Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot. He has a sort of a long list. But my point is that there are no human institutions known that are safe. There is no way of organizing human society that has no risks. And the standard conventional way of doing it with governments sometimes works tolerably. All of us are still alive. We're not starving to death. No one's killed us. Doesn't seem to work very well. And it sometimes works catastrophically badly. And I could imagine ways in which what I'm describing would fail. My claim is only that there are ways in which it could work, and that if it did work, it would provide a more attractive outcome than the systems we know. That's as strong a claim as I'm willing to make. Thank you.
Temos uma pergunta lá atrás da plateia.
Professor Friedman, thank you very much for coming here to Brazil. My name is José Antonio Ziberg, and I am the head of the legal department at CADE, that is the Brazilian Antitrust Agency. And because of that, I would have a lot of questions to make tonight to you. But one that I would like to focus is based in your new book and the creation of cyberspace. How do you see these new facts related to the creation of this new cyberspace related to United States Constitution and the First Amendment? How do you think that free expression will change, our perspective will change with the creation of this new?
One of the attractive features of what I refer to as a world of strong privacy, the kind of online world where you can control, where you can say things and people can't prove who said them, but you can still have a reputation, is that it gives you a form of freedom of speech that does not depend on the Supreme Court. Because after all, the U.S. Supreme Court only has power in the U.S. It does no good elsewhere. And the Supreme Court sometimes changes its opinions. So I would rather rely on the laws of mathematics, which are what encryption depends on, than on the laws of the Supreme Court. If you're interested in my more general views on law, the book before Future Imperfect was called Law's Order, the nonfiction. I also published a novel in between. That you can read on my webpage for free, as you can read Future Imperfect. I should say I'm not actually in favor of enforcing copyright law. That is, I can see why other people would be. But my own view is that since I am writing books not mainly as a source of income, but mainly as a way of spreading ideas, I prefer to have them readily available online for people to read, and so whenever I can, I do that with my books. And one solution to the problem of being unable to enforce copyright online is that instead of making your living by writing books and getting royalties for the books, you make your living by writing books, the books make you famous, and nice people then invite you to come to Brazil and pay you for giving a talk there. And that's what is a tie-in solution to the problem of copyright. But anyway, the general issue of law is the subject of law's order, and it's not a particularly libertarian book, I don't think, but I think it does reveal that designing legal systems is a non-trivial problem, that there really are a lot of complicated issues that don't occur to sort of people who are thinking of it in political ideology and not in terms of potential hard legal problems.
David, o senhor estudou o caso histórico da Islândia. Como o Estado surgiu lá? Vou repetir. O senhor estudou o caso histórico da Islândia? Como o Estado surgiu lá? Por que o sistema privado de leis acabou?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the answer, it's not one where I know the answer. I have conjectures. To begin with, Iceland was never an anarcho-capitalist society. Various people online claim that I claimed it was, but if you read my article on the subject, which is on my webpage, my claim is not that it was anarcho-capitalist, but that law enforcement was private, and which is a part, but not complete. Iceland had a single system of courts, it had a legislature to make law, but the enforcement of that law was entirely private. And it therefore gives us information about one piece of the anarcho-capitalist puzzle, as it were. But the one possible answer to the question, and I have several possible answers to why it finally broke down, but one answer goes back to our discussion of economies of scale. Because in the original Icelandic system, you had something which I've sometimes called franchise feudalism, in the sense that any Icelander had to plug into the legal system through what they called a gothi. But there were about 39 different gothi, and you could choose anyone who would have you. So it was a competitive system. And one of the things that happens in the final period when the system is breaking down is that you're getting large coalitions. So that in effect, rather than being able to play off one gothi against another, the best you can do is to play off one coalition against another one somewhere else. And that's the period when you start getting relatively serious violence among them, in part, I think, because in the first 2 centuries, when people were fighting, it was basically over legal disputes. You have wronged me, you haven't given me the right compensation, so I'll go fight you. And in the last 50 years or so, I think they're partly fighting in the assumption the system is going to break down, and each of them wants to make sure he's the ruler when it's over. So it's switching from a private enforcement feud conflict to something more like a civil war at the end. But there are a number of possible theories about why that happened, and I don't want to claim that I really know. What I do know is that the Icelandic system lasted for about a third of a millennium, about 330 years. It finally broke down during the last 50 years of that period. And the available figures suggest that although the level of violence was high by their standards, it was low by ours. That in the period of breakdown, it looks as though the death rate per capita was probably vaguely similar to the U.S. highway death rate. Probably below the Brazilian murder rate at the moment, though I don't have statistics for that. Now, we can't be sure because we don't have good data, but that's what I think it suggests. And that if you compare it, the one way I sometimes put it is that I think that in 3 weeks of the year 1066, 3 different countries, England, Normandy, and Norway, lost a larger fraction of their population to violent conflict than Iceland did in its last 50 years of violence. So anyway, but it did break down, and it may have been because it became a more concentrated system, but I'm not sure.
Vamos para a última pergunta. São duas parecidas, eu vou ler as duas. Existe alguma diferença entre o sistema legal que você acabou de descrever e o proposto por Murray Rothbard? E como conciliar a defesa ética libertária da não iniciação da agressão com a defesa utilitária da livre competição de lawmaking?
Yes. I am not an expert on Murray Rothbard, but my understanding of the fundamental difference between our views of anarchy is that he imagined that legal philosophers would work out the correct legal code and everybody would agree to it, whereas I imagine that you will have a polylegal system with courts in effect competing to produce legal codes that customers want to live under. So that from my standpoint, he's making a mistake similar to the mistake of people who think if only we told the government how to build cars, they'd build good cars. Of course, he didn't want a government. He was an anarchist too. But in the sense that he's imagining that people get the right rules because they're good people, whereas I'm imagining that people get the right rules for the same reason that restaurants make good food, because it's in their rational self-interest to do it. So in that sense, it's a different model. Now, I may be being unfair. I never actually argued these issues with Murray, although I knew him slightly. But as far as I can tell, at least, his view was that you were to deduce the just libertarian code. Beyond that, on the general question of different bases for libertarianism, my view is that I have no good way of showing that my moral beliefs are right. I do have pretty good arguments for my economic beliefs. Furthermore, I believe that if my economic beliefs are right, I don't have to convince people of my moral beliefs. Because although people's moral beliefs differ, they don't differ that much. There are very few people who will say, what I want is a world where people are hungry and ignorant. So if I'm right that the institutions that I want would produce not only a world that libertarians would like better, but a world that most socialists would like better too, then I don't have to persuade the socialists that their principles are wrong. All I have to do is persuade them that their economics are wrong. And since I have better economic arguments than moral arguments, I'd rather try to do that. So I really see it partly as going back to my point that law is complicated. I think the moral arguments are not as simple as many libertarians think. Furthermore, even if the argument from one point to another is simple, I do not think any of us have really good arguments for showing that our starting point is right. That when I originally read Ayn Rand, what intrigued me was that she thought she had solved Hume's is-ought problem. She thought she could derive oughts from the facts of reality. I concluded that she didn't, that she was mistaken. I don't think anyone else has done it either. And therefore, I would rather not try to base my arguments for libertarianism on the idea that it's morally right, but rather on the idea that it produces the kind of results that most people would like.
Fantástico, David. Muito obrigado.
One final point. As many of you realize, although I was happy to speak at an Austrian conference, I am not an Austrian economist. I'm an American economist. I think the emphasis on schools of economic thought on the whole is overdone. There is good economics, some of which is done by people who think they're Austrians and some people who think they aren't, and there's bad economics, ditto. But I did want to make my contribution to the Mises Institute of Brazil by giving them a copy of my book, Hidden Order, which describes my view of economics. And you can all read it and tell me why it's wrong.
Thank you, David.